I'm Jim Williams, and it's my pleasure to introduce you to a CBS Chicago original documentary series, Stories to Tell. These stories are our legacy. They speak to the heart of the city. We'll start with some folks who worked in a theater like this one and a whole lot of other places. I know it well. It shaped my entire life.
This is going to sound silly. I had an uncle that worked for the state, and he said, I'll get you a summer job, $10 an hour. Now, this is 1969. Standing on the side of the road holding a flag and running getting coffee for the adults. And I said, no, thank you. I want to work for $1.95 an hour and watch the Cubs play.
I can't imagine a better job for a kid who's 16 years old and just trying to figure out the world, figure out the city, and figure out themselves.
It was the greatest experience of my life. I really believe it shaped the kind of adult that I was.
Well, it was unique. People today would never know anything about Andy Frain if we didn't tell stories.
Andy Frain ushers were once everywhere in Chicago. All the stadiums, racetracks, conventions, concert halls.
I saw Frank Sinatra twice.
Janis Joplin.
The Beatles 3 times.
James Brown, Al Green.
Rolling Stones.
I saw Fat Elvis.
The Who.
And Skinny Elvis.
They escorted celebrities.
This is Janet Leigh.
And occasionally chauffeured politicians.
And we're with Bobby Kennedy and Mayor Daley.
They worked parades and ushered at enormous dinners for royalty and for presidents, once catching John F. Kennedy's eye.
And the usher that was with him heard him say, "Oh, I didn't know Andy had girls now."
The assignments were exciting, occasionally boring, and, well, unusual.
Andy Frain ushers used to serve as pallbearers. Andy Frain ushers were escorts for proper young ladies to go to the junior prom.
For teenagers, it was a coveted job. You worked events people were paying to see, or events making history, and you had authority.
And just wearing a suit, for me, was awesome because I almost felt like it was leading me to the right path.
I put on this quasi-military uniform for most of the 1970s, starting when I was 16. It was my first job, and it's had an enormous impact on the rest of my working life. The first lesson in how to maintain control in difficult situations.
I'm not going to let you bully him like that.
I mean, you're not going to, nobody's here to bully anybody, sir. Many former ushers describe a personal transformation on the job.
Well, when I started at 15, I was, believe it or not, a shy, quiet kid.
Now that is hard to believe. By the time I joined the company, Mike Narduli had the bearing of a Marine drill sergeant. He once chewed me out at White Sox Park for letting a handful of people sit in the box seats on a cold night in September when perhaps 5,000 people were in the ballpark. Rules were rules. They didn't have tickets for the box seats. My 16-year-old knees were shaking.
Through the years, I lost the shyness and lost the quietness and developed a lot of self-confidence.
It's the story of thousands of men and women, crowd control engineers, we were called. Where else could a teenager work all over the Chicago area and serve every group from every neighborhood?
From the city, from the suburbs, people who were very wealthy and well-to-do, people who were poor.
It was a learning experience. I don't know that we truly recognized it as such at the time.
Right. But you see it now.
But we see it now.
I am who I am because of the time I spent in Andy Frain.
My grandfather was Andrew T. Frain. He had a very entrepreneurial spirit and a drive that was like no other.
Andrew T. Frain was from Chicago's back-of-the-yards neighborhood. Suffocating stench from the slaughterhouses hung over young Andy's home, where he grew up one of 17 kids.
He was 16 out of 17, and he always said that at a very young age he got a head start on crowd control because he was busy organizing the whole Frain clan at the time.
From an early age, he was a hard worker, selling seat cushions at Comiskey Park. Across town, Frain took some tough guys from his neighborhood to replace the pickpockets and other miscreants working as ushers at Wrigley Field.
They were able to control chaos. Got rid of these thieves, weeded them out one by one.
William Wrigley, owner of the Cubs, was so impressed he gave the 28-year-old Frain $5,000 and a company was born. Eventually, Andy Frain Incorporated expanded to every major venue in Chicago and several other cities. A man with only a grade school education created an institution.
I don't know how you properly describe Andy Frain, except to say he was obviously so business savvy.
Despite the company's reach, it was run like a ma-and-pop shop. Frain's wife, Dolly, was the company's treasurer. His children donned the blue and gold, the colors of his beloved Notre Dame. He was a hands-on boss and disciplinarian, as Jim Kennard found out when his alarm didn't work and he overslept one morning.
He didn't scream or anything, but he summarily fired me and told me to have a great life. And they hired me back, and the message was delivered that no matter what the excuse, you should be at the job when you're committed to be at the job.
At stadiums and theaters, Frain had his ushers line up for inspections. Uniforms had to be pressed, shirts and gloves spotless, shoes shined, and no facial hair.
Because he wanted to create the professionalism. He wanted to command authority.
At no place were Andy Frain's standards carried out with greater precision than Chicago Stadium, the domain of one Lester Modesti.
Oh, Lester was the man.
City of Chicago worker by day, the stadium's chief usher at night and on weekends.
Lester was a guy who was short of stature, balding, and took his job as the head of Andy Frain at the Chicago Stadium very seriously. He treated the building as though it belonged to him and not to Arthur Wirtz.
And as he walked by, you had to have your hands out like that.
And what would happen if your white gloves had a smudge?
You either probably end up in the second balcony or you might not even work that night.
There were people washing their gloves in the bathroom and drying them on the air dryer.
Lester and ushers of his generation had seen it all, from a time when fans wore suits and dresses to ball games, to raucous events that challenged crowd control and eardrums. When the Beatles played Chicago, the Ushers had never seen such enthusiasm.
I mean, I've been in loud places, right? But this was unbelievable. Unbelievable.
In 1968, at the International Amphitheater, Democrats gathered for their national convention.
The first day we got to the amphitheater, it was like a prison camp. The National Guard was there. They had barbed wire all over the place.
As Chicago police clashed with anti-Vietnam War protesters downtown, the scene inside the amphitheater matched the divisions across the country.
Chaos, just chaos, and fights on the floor.
Literally pushing, shoving, we're getting into fist fights.
My parents being really nervous that I was going down there, staying until 2 in the morning and then getting up the next day and going back.
Over the next decade, the gigs got even rougher.
Chicago police were out in force,
and weirder, sometimes to comic effect. Bill Clark was an usher working the musical Hair, which featured nudity.
And I'm instructing my ushers, anyone takes off their clothes in the audience, leave them alone. There was a gentleman, a younger gentleman standing on the landing, smoking a cigarette with absolutely no clothes on whatsoever. And I said, sir, there's no smoking in the auditorium.
At the height of the counterculture, Andy Frain ushers in their conservative attire had to control large crowds of kids their own age, and more than a few fists were thrown.
After a while, I stopped working rock concerts because there was so often clashes with the customers.
The uniform, which had once commanded respect from everyone, made us objects of scorn among many of our teenage peers.
Everybody said, why'd you take that job? He said, you have to wear that goofy uniform.
Sometimes the heat came from rock stars. Steve Sarley says he was double-crossed by Elton John, who, while on stage, pleaded with Sarley to keep a surging crowd at bay.
And all of a sudden I feel a tap on my shoulder. And I turn around, I look, and there's Elton John. He's like crouched down by a catcher over me. And he's like this. He leans over into my ear and he says, help me. I need you to help me. Save me from the people. I'm scared. I'm so scared. Get the people away from me. I don't want to be hurt. I said, okay, fine. So I told the usher, I said, everybody grab, lock arms. And we're going to start moving forward and moving the people back away from the stage. And all of a sudden I hear Elton John say, security guards, leave my fans alone. If you want to get in the fight, join the army. I don't want that here. I love my fans. Leave them alone. And I'm like, boy, did we get set up. The fists started flying. We're getting punched, scratched, clawed at, knocked down, kicked and stomped. It was brutal, and I know he's retiring. I hope he enjoys his retirement. I'll never forget what a jerk he was that particular time.
That was the environment when I joined Andy Frain in 1973, convinced to apply by my best friend, David Harper.
Just turned 16. My mom came home and said, you know, you got to get a job. You can't sit around here all summer doing nothing. I used to go to a lot of ball games and a lot of sporting events when I was a kid. I used to see these guys in the blue uniforms at the games. I said, man, that'd be a great job to have.
Our first assignment, though, was a rock concert, the Edgar Winter Group. I hated it. Oh, I liked the music, but the volume that night at the amphitheater was blistering. My ears were ringing throughout the next day, that and fans blowing marijuana smoke in my face. I wanted to quit. Oh no, my mother said, you don't quit a job after one day. So I stayed, and so did David.
I had a really unique opportunity to learn and see people at their best and see people at their worst.
At a sold-out Marvin Gaye concert, David, working the gate, had a gun pulled on him by a fan without a ticket.
And pointed it at me and said, I'm walking in. He had his girlfriend with him. And I said, right this way, sir. You head in, have a good time, enjoy the concert.
In the summer of 1975, Alvin Lee, and 10 years after, would not play another encore at the amphitheater. Fans rioted.
The crowd went berserk, absolutely berserk. And the last thing you want to see happen is people start throwing things. And it's kind of like a cascading effect. When one person throws something, the next person is throwing. First it's a chair, first it's a bottle.
One of those bottles hit me square in the back of the head.
It actually knocked you unconscious. I thought you had been killed.
Even worse was what happened after the toughest usher I knew, a high school football star named Paul Lonzo, confronted a threatening fan.
When this guy came up to him, Paul was like, come on, shoot your best shot. So he stabbed him.
Paul survived, but you might wonder, if we faced occasional peril, why did we stay with this company for little more than minimum wage? Well, it was a challenge. It was exciting, an adrenaline rush, and we were loyal to one another.
We stuck together. We might have had a little infighting, but when it came to us and them, it was us.
I see some old, beautiful history here. Here's my dad, Mike. Here's my grandfather, Andy.
Andrew T. Frain died in 1964, 4 years after his wife was killed in a plane crash. Their children took over and maintained the high standards.
It was a tremendous amount of pressure. Fortunately, though, they grew up in the business.
The company's workforce became more diverse. While many young people found jobs close to home in a segregated city, we traveled all over Chicago and created friendships across racial lines.
You know, I grew up in Chatham near 87th and Cottage Grove, middle-class African-American neighborhood. This job really opened up the entire city to you, to the diversity of people in the city, to their experiences, which were not like yours.
You know, I came from an all-Italian neighborhood on the west side of Chicago on Chicago Avenue, and would have led a sheltered life. And working for Andy Frain, I got to work with people of all incomes and nationalities and races and religions, and made friends and just got to be so much more of a whole person.
Having these young African American girls nicely dressed, telling people where they could or could not go, who were unaccustomed to taking direction from anyone of color, required a level of diplomacy that the average 16 or 17-year-old cannot or could not perform.
And this younger generation challenged the bosses.
It'd be 20 below zero, and you have to come in the skirt because that's the uniform. We said it's too cold out here for us to wear skirts. and we need to be able to wear pants. The following year, I'll never forget it, they said, you know, you're right, you ought to be wearing pants in this cold weather, and they allowed us to wear pants thereafter.
Leadership nurtured at a young age. Today, Kathy Adusi is the president of River Forest.
A man walks up to me and he's screaming in Arabic at me.
For 5 years, Ertharin Cousin was the executive director of the United Nations World Food Program, the world's largest humanitarian organization addressing hunger.
Those skills that helped you deal with that belligerent fan are skills that I dealt with in a Jordanian refugee camp when I am dealing with someone who was very angry about the lack of access to food that they had.
Her sister Tybura is a top executive for IBM with worldwide responsibilities.
So you embrace every situation, which is how you had to do it as an Andy Frain. You had to be visible and present. And I think it's how we engage with people today.
Jim Garnard, fired and rehired by Andy Sr. all those years ago. He's been the CEO of 5 tech companies.
4 of them in the Valley, 1 here in Chicago. Just sold the last one to GE about 5 years ago.
A mere sample of the success stories among Andy Frain alumni.
When you really peel back the onion, that was the foundation that was set.
As teenagers at ball games and rock concerts, the ballet and the symphony, political conventions and high society dinners.
I train all the Sara Lee employees, so I travel the country. So it gave me those skills to deal with all different walks of life, all kinds of different people.
In the 1990s, the Frain family sold the company. The major venues in town had started hiring their own ushers. Contracts to provide security at airports also ended. The new owners filed for bankruptcy. Francis Frain, the founder's son, told the Chicago Tribune, "My father must be rolling over in his grave. It's such a shame. It's all gone."
The only thing I can say, Jim, on that is I was just sad. You know, it was something that kids will never have the opportunity that I had.
There is an Andy Frain company today. Andy Sr.'s granddaughter Kelly and her husband Dave Clayton acquired the Frain name and built an enormous security firm with offices and contracts across the country.
I get very emotional when I think about it because Andy Frain is my life, is our family's life. It's something I take to heart.
Still, Andy Frain ushers are gone, but the wide range of experiences and the life lessons live in our memories and in the stories we tell.